Hey guys, it's Candace.
And it's Elena.
And this is Cousins on Crime. Okay, Lena, are you ready for part 2?
Let's do it. I'm ready to hear what's going on.
Lena's wrapped up over there in a sweatshirt. She's got her hair in a messy bun. She's ready. Okay, guys, this is part 2 of our twisted tale of serial killer Pee-wee Gaskins. If you haven't listened to part 1, just pause this episode and go back and listen to part 1. We covered Pee-wee's childhood and adolescence, his behavior, and like the evolution of his crimes, and also his introduction to being in trouble with the law. And we ended on a crime that he had committed in 1952 that landed him in the slammer for 6 years. He cracked open a girl's skull with an axe. So in 1953... Pee-wee was in prison for that vicious attack, and I told you in part 1 that it was at this point in time that his crimes would finally result in murder, right? And I say finally because I believe he tried to kill people before and he just didn't succeed. Seems to me when you hit someone on the head with an axe, you're trying to kill them.
Exactly.
I might be naive, but I believe he was trying to murder before, but he didn't succeed.
Okay. So we're just escalating.
Exactly. We talked about in part 1 about his stay in reform school, and it was horrible for him, but he was in prison now, baby. He was with the big boys. Things would be getting pretty ugly for him now. Like, don't drop the soap kind of ugly.
Oh.
And he knew it. He knew how he had been treated his whole life and in reform school. And he even told his attorney when he arrived in prison, he was nervous.
Because he's a little guy.
Exactly. He was like, I'm in the big time now, so this is some serious business. But those nerves wouldn't hinder him from anything sinister. Of course not. In fact, those nerves were the driving force for him to hatch a plan to get the other prisoners and guards to leave him the heck alone.
Okay.
The abuse and violence towards him had already begun as soon as he got there. And he knew what was required to stay afloat in prison. It's kind of common knowledge. Violence.
Yeah.
Though he was older now, he was still a small guy. I mean, he never grew past 5 feet 4 inches, which is how tall I am. So if I was face to face with him, I could just slap him, you know? I could just reach him right there. But he knew he better just set the tone real quick in prison. But he can't just go in there swinging, because he's little. He's little, shrimpy. He'd need to play some sort of a long game, getting good with someone who was respected in the prison. And that inmate's name was Hazel Brazel.
Oh, hey.
I'm so annoyed that he has my daughter's name. He controlled a lot of the happenings there. He had minions. And Pee-wee knew if he was going to get close to Hazel, he'd have to wait a little bit and put in his time. And then he'd murder him.
Right.
To show everybody who's boss.
Okay.
As you do.
Oh, wow.
Pee-wee ended up slitting the throat of Hazel while he was on the toilet.
Oh. How vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he told the warden it was self-defense. I don't know how you could argue self-defense when the guy was otherwise engaged, but nevertheless, that was his defense.
Okay.
For that, for the murder of Hazel Brazel, Pee-wee was put in solitary confinement for 6 months. And when he got out into the general population, he was feared by everyone. So, he did do what he set out to do.
Right.
And because he was so manipulative and just like a loose cannon, and everybody was already scared of him, he was able to convince even Hazel Brazel's men to follow him, even though he had just killed their leader. So, they were clearly not very loyal
Right.
in the beginning. I mean, in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So now he was in charge. He kind of referred to himself as a power man. Now, for the murder of Hazel, he did get 6 months solitary, but he also got 3 years added to his sentence.
3 years.
Mm-hmm. He had a decent rest of his stay in prison. So like I said, he did accomplish what he set out to do. He got everyone scared of him, and he kind of, coasted along. But 3 years, man. 3 additional years for a murder just doesn't feel right to me. But this is a theme we're going to see with him. It's ridiculous. And I need to just slip some info in right here. Pee-wee had been married a couple times by this point.
Married?
Married. As in, like, someone chose to be with him. He got married before he went to prison. He even had another marriage while he was in prison. And he'd be married more times later on. Don't worry. I just didn't feel the need to get into, like, all his wives' names and, like, the dates and stuff, because I don't feel it really adds to the story. But I will mention his wives throughout the story as they pertain, like, to the events.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1955, his wife at that time filed for divorce while he was in prison. You see, he had been receiving conjugal visits with her, and they had to have sex in, like, really weird places, and she just was uncomfortable with that. That was just...
Yeah.
The last time she had visited him in prison, she told him that she didn't want to have sex on a park bench or behind a bush.
Oh,
you know?
my
Like,
gosh.
she's like, can you be a little more romantic, please? And she's like, I'm not going to do this.
Okay.
So,
but did they get married while he was in prison? Was
I
that
don't know
allowed
if
back then?
this was the wife that he married in prison,
Okay.
or if this was the wife that he married before he went in.
Okay.
But she had to know he was a bad guy.
Yeah.
I mean, whether she chose him before he went in or chose him after he was in,
Yeah.
she was aware of his crimes.
Well,
Let's
but
just
I
put it that
asked
way.
because, like, if you married him while he was in prison, like, you knew, like, did you not know what you were signing up for? But
Right.
carry on.
I really believe she knew what she was signing up for. I think she just wished they could have maybe had sex in his bed or something, not like in the field, which is, I don't know what conjugal visits are like in prison.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's a place where they allow you to have sex with your wife or your partner or whatever, but I can imagine it is better than a bush.
Yeah.
Like, I would think that if the prison is going to allow you to see your wife, they would give you a place to do that, right?
Well, I don't know. Do you have that kind of opportunity when you're in prison? Like, do they just allow that?
Some do, but some don't. It's like a privilege.
Okay.
A conjugal visit is a privilege. I don't know why he was getting any privileges, but he was.
Okay.
So, for whatever reason, he was wanting to have sex in these weird places. She refused, and he forced himself on her.
Of course.
And, despite all he had done previously that she was aware of, this was a step too far. So she was done with him at that point.
Well.
Shortly thereafter, he received divorce papers, and he lost his mind.
Oh, like he didn't already.
Right. He didn't have a mind to begin with. He was so angry that he escaped from prison.
To go find her?
He hid in a garbage barrel, and he was taken out with the trash. Isn't that fitting? You know, we talked about in part 1 that he had escaped from reform school, and that's pretty wild. Like, he just ran out in a field. He was just able to escape. But prison?
Yeah.
Like, how does it happen that someone could simply hide in a garbage barrel and be wheeled out with the trash? You know what I mean? Well, he did. He escaped from prison. And, spoiler, this wouldn't be the first time. He fled to North Carolina. He ended up shacking up with a girl named Betty. And Betty had this sob story that her brother was in jail and she needed help bailing him out. Well, they went up to Knoxville, Tennessee. And he said, I'll help you bail out your brother. He was on the run. He's like, you know, from one prisoner to another, I'll pay it forward.
Okay.
So he helped her bail out her brother, and they all went back to a motel to celebrate. Well, when Pee-wee woke up the next morning, she and her brother, I'm doing air quotes, were gone. Spoiler alert. It was not her brother.
Interesting.
And shortly after he realized the couple was gone and he'd been duped, the police showed up to take him back to prison. Betty had called the authorities and given them his location.
Work.
But thank you for your services to the community, Betty. I mean, thank you for that. So back to South Carolina. And back to prison he went to serve the rest of his sentence, plus the 3 months for the escape. 3 months. He got an additional 3 months. No. And we can clearly see the little slaps on the wrist here. You know, 3 years for murdering Hazel Brazel, 3 months for escaping. They taught him one thing, and that was that he was willing to endure just a little more time to continue his violence.
Yeah, exactly.
And what does that tell you about someone who, like, you have plans to eventually release into society?
Right.
Like, seeing his behavior, his reckless behavior. He has no conscience, no regard for consequence.
Well, I just recently watched a documentary, and the prisoner said he was a reoffender. And he said he got 8 years the first time. He's like, oh, that's no big deal. I can do 8 years. Like, he knew that if he kept doing these crimes, it was just a slap on the wrist. I can handle that and satisfy myself as well.
Well, and they get fed.
Yeah.
They have a place to sleep. They are able to work out. They're able to play cards, make friends. You know, it's, for some people, prison is not, you know, it's a better situation than what they had.
True.
I mean, you see a lot of indigent people committing crimes just so they can go to prison and have a meal.
Yeah.
Or a roof over their heads. So, yeah, he just didn't care. And we know this because when he did get out eventually, he very soon after sexually assaulted a girl on a farm. And when she ran from him, he hit her in the head with a hammer. Wow. Does this sound familiar to you? Well, luckily, just like the girl that was hit with the axe, she survived, and she was able to identify him. So back to prison he went for another 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah. Just like the first time. And I don't want to say this particular prison stay was smooth sailing for him because it's prison. But because of the first term that he served, people knew him and they knew not to mess with him. And he wasn't out for long. So, you know, some of the same prisoners were still there. The same guards were still there. Now, he was eventually released from prison again in 1961. And Jimmy Crackcorn, he returned to his life of crime. I know you don't believe that, Lena. I know you're like, girl, you be kidding. He couldn't help himself but to do what he always had done to make money and keep his head above water in between prison stays. And I think he was also helping his mother financially at this time too, because I read something about that. But he wasn't going to go to McDonald's and get a job. They do background checks, I think. Back in the 60s, I don't know. All he really could do because of his record was commit more crimes or do the plowing and the work on the tobacco fields and, you know, all the other grunt work, basically.
Right.
So he went back to burglarizing homes, and yet again, he was able to do this undetected. And, Lena, you'll be happy to know he found God.
Okay. That does
Not
make
really.
me happy. Okay.
April Fools!
Yeah.
It's not April. He didn't really find God. Perhaps God found him, though, because he started traveling around with a traveling preacher.
Okay, this
and
is
he was
interesting.
assisting him with, like, evangelistic duties on the road. I don't know specifically what those were, but, like, you know, helping a preacher. I don't know.
Interesting.
This might have been an opportunity for him to
Take
find
advantage.
God.
Well, okay.
Have a better life. Have a, I don't know, moral compass. No. This just allowed him to make a little money. But more importantly, this enabled him to pursue his passion, which was committing crimes and not getting caught. And because he was on the road, hopping around from place to place, crimes that were being committed were not being tied to him. Because he was here, he was there, he was over here when they're finding out about that over there, you know?
Yeah.
Burglaries and rapes weren't even really associated with each other as being, like, committed by the same person, because he was sloppy and disorganized, and he didn't really have, like, a method of operation per se. He was just flailing around committing crimes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, investigators, they rely on consistency to solve crimes and tie things together, and when things are just kind of all over the place, you know.
He just did what felt right in the moment, I
Exactly. Guess. He was just spur of the moment. He never had a plan, really.
Yeah.
But because he was sloppy, again, he would find himself in hot water when he slept with a 14-year-old.
Oh, gosh.
And though it was consensual, the girl admits, the state didn't care. You know, the state really doesn't care.
Well, not back
that
in
a 14-year-old,
those days.
Yeah, well, and not these days either. The state really doesn't care if you think a 14-year-old can consent. You know what I mean?
Right.
So they were going to prosecute a statutory rape charge. So they're all at the solicitor's office in the courthouse. Him, his lawyer, the solicitor. And they offered him a 6-year prison sentence if he pled to the statutory rape charge. 6 years.
Okay.
The solicitor's probably like, let's just save time here. You know, plead out to this. I'll have my secretary drop the paperwork. And Pee-wee was like, I want you to go back in there. He's talking to his attorney. Go back in there and tell him I'll do 3 years, not 6. And I want to be assigned to the chain gang while I'm there.
Oh, okay. Give him what he wants, guys.
Pee-wee, sir. Number one, he was in no position to negotiate at this point. Number two, he just wanted to be on the chain gang so he could escape again.
Right, exactly.
That much is obvious. But this little demand may have just been a diversion tactic, because he had no intention of going back to prison for any amount of time, actually. The solicitor's office was on the 2nd floor of the courthouse, but he noticed that the big frame window he was staring out of was operational. So he raised up that window and he jumped out of the window.
I've heard of that story.
Ted Bundy style. Ted Bundy. He didn't exactly stick the landing. One of his legs sort of kind of locked in place.
Oh,
and he hit the ground and it kind of jammed up into his hip.
Oh, ouch.
And because of that, he would acquire a limp for the rest of his life because of that particular stunt. And he was injured, but he got up and ran.
Yeah.
So he was successful in stealing a car near the courthouse, and he made it all the way to Florida. He made it to Florida. And if I recall correctly, I feel like Ted Bundy also went to Florida after he jumped out of that window. That's weird. Could be wrong. Write us if you know. And because he could not lay low, Lena, for 5 seconds, he started hanging out with a 16-year-old in town.
What in the world?
Yeah.
Just trying to become one of the locals?
Yeah, exactly. 16 was actually the age of consent in time at the time in Florida. So he was like, legally, I can't get in trouble for this. But her parents were like, no. Who are you, sir? Mm-hmm. And also, Pee-wee, can I remind you that you just escaped from custody? So if you want to talk about being legally in trouble for anything, maybe you should be concerned about that.
Yeah.
You know? Well, word started to spread that there was this creepy guy in town who was hitting on young girls, and someone remembered. They remembered seeing something about some guy on the news from South Carolina who was wanted for a sexual crime involving a minor. And it didn't take long for locals to connect the dots and notify authorities. Mm-hmm. So when he got back to South Carolina, they were like, okay, where were we? Oh, yes, we were discussing the punishment for the statutory rape when you jumped out the window.
Yeah.
So let's get back to that. They offered him a deal, 6 years, as they offered him before.
Why not lay it on thick? Like,
that's what I'm
saying.
Why offer him a deal?
Jeez.
So anyway, he took the deal. They did give him an additional year for the escape, but again,
they just know he's gonna keep escaping.
Exactly. Lena, would you believe me if I said he escaped again after that?
Actually, I do. Okay, I do.
Well, he escaped again after that. This time, he and 2 other inmates shimmied their way through a large drainage pipe.
He's just getting creative at this point.
I mean, it's funny because it's not funny. Like, it's comical because, are you serious? Right. Are we talking about a cartoon here? You know, he's taken out in the trash. Now he's going through the drainage. It's like, is this a joke? Well, once they all got out of this drainage pipe and they were free, they all kind of fanned out and went their separate ways. I don't really know what happened to the other 2, but Pee-wee was on the run for 28 days.
Fun. Did he have lots of fun?
28 days. Well, yeah, he was. He was all over the Carolinas. He went to Georgia. He made it up to Tennessee again. And he was stealing a car here, stealing money for gas there, then dumping the stolen car for a new one in another location. You know, he's just hopping around, doing what he gotta do. So he's adding to his resume out there on the streets. But it was in Tennessee that he woke up one morning after sleeping in one of those cars that he stole. And he woke up to a swift poke in his back by the barrel of a gun. It was the FBI.
Found you.
F to the B to the I. And this is the part where I usually say, and back he went to South Carolina. But there was a question here as to whether or not Tennessee wanted to hold him for the crimes that he had committed there. Remember, you know, he was stealing cars all over the place in different states. Ultimately, they thought it might muddy the waters a bit, and it would be more valuable to extradite him back to South Carolina. I wish I knew what the laws were in Tennessee at that time, because they could have been more strict. And considering all the slaps on the wrist, maybe he would have had a worse time. Well, they came to an arrangement. Yes, an arrangement, even though he was in the middle of a prison sentence when he escaped. But now the FBI was involved, because he was crossing state lines, committing those crimes. And they wanted him to serve federal prison time.
Thank you.
They offered to commute his current sentence because he pled to the fugitive charges. and he'd go serve 5 years in federal prison in Atlanta.
5 years.
Are you seeing a theme here?
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're making all these little conversions and exceptions, and why didn't they just tack on federal time?
Yeah.
You know, as in he'd go to federal prison after he was done with his sentence in South Carolina. Or if federal prison takes precedent, like I don't know the law there, have him serve the federal time after he finishes in South Carolina.
Right. At some point,
why are they consolidating things?
Right. Someone's got to say, y'all aren't handling business. Let's do it my way and lay it on thick.
Yeah, I mean, he's a violent reoffender.
Yeah. Come on, guys.
Why are they making exceptions and like, just the consolidation of sentences? I don't get that. I just don't get it. He was clearly not bothered, though, by going to prison. He was a flight risk, even in prison. But he didn't care.
Yeah.
He'd escaped multiple times already. There is something very scary about a person who has no sense of fear whatsoever.
Right.
They have no boundaries, no limits. Well, in federal prison, he needed to do the same thing he did back in South Carolina, and that was link up with someone really high up.
Mm-hmm.
This time, he didn't particularly plan to kill the person. I don't know why. Maybe he felt like that might be a step too far. But he ended up linking up with a fellow inmate that had ties to the mafia. Maybe that's why. Because he thought he'd be a dead duck if he killed a mafia guy. But this guy had been convicted for mafia-related crimes like money, murder, etc. So he found refuge being friends with this guy. And business opportunities, because he was able to help this guy in exchange for protection and, you know, make money as well. When he was done with federal prison, the original charges from South Carolina couldn't be pursued because the statute of limitations was up for those. So, like I said, they couldn't. Why didn't they have him finish his sentence, then go to federal prison? But they could do something about the escape and the auto theft that he committed.
Okay.
So they did pursue 2 auto theft charges, but at this time he would not plead to anything. He decided he was going to take his chances with a jury trial. Unfortunately, because it was only auto theft and escape, the sentencing options weren't as heavy as, say, a murder charge or an attempted murder charge. So he was convicted and given 2 consecutive 2-year terms. And by all accounts, that stay in prison was pretty uneventful. By this time, he knew what to do. People knew him. People feared him. And by November 1968, Pee-wee was out on parole again. I'd move.
Sounds like a great idea.
If I was a local and someone in the neighborhood Facebook page was like, guys, Pee-wee's out again, I'd be out of there.
Right.
I would move. I mean, I'm sure they didn't have Facebook back then, but maybe the neighbors had like a community bulletin board or something that they shared local news on.
Do you remember as kids on the TV, we had watched the news scroll? Do you remember that?
Yes.
There was one specific news channel. The town news, what was happening, would just scroll.
Saginaw.
Yeah. Okay.
That's so funny.
I just had
Kids these days would think that was wild.
Yeah.
Now we just scroll through our phones.
Yeah.
We can see that the violent crimes that Pee-wee had committed thus far were consistent. They were consistent in the brutality. Attacking those women with an axe and a hammer, slashing someone's throat like he killed that inmate, raping people. I mean, these are very up close and personal, violent attacks. But now things would escalate they would get worse. And you might be wondering, like, how do they get worse?
Yeah.
They get worse.
Oh my gosh.
He met a woman while he was out on parole, settled down. They had a daughter together. Lord, someone pray for that child. And he started cheating on his wife, citing that she was fat.
Oh, Lord.
After having his child, he said she was skinny before. She was even cute when she was pregnant. But the woman put on weight after she gave birth to that child. The
well,
nerve.
I'm sorry.
I feel some little sort of relief knowing that I'm not Pee Wee Gaskins' type right now. Like, I just...
Yeah.
He wouldn't have looked twice at me, thank the Lord. So, he was traveling around doing these jobs, cheating on his wife, and his wife honestly really didn't care that much because he was still coming home to her. He was bringing the money back home. He was helping out with the kid. So she was like, whatever. He's still coming home to me. What a keeper.
Mm-hmm.
The following year, in 1969, he considered himself to be living the high life. And compared to his past, he somewhat was. I mean, he was making good money in this car theft ring that he had started. Little entrepreneur, that Pee Wee Gaskins. So he was still committing crimes, but he had a wife that didn't mind if he slept with other women. They had a trailer. He had money. They were staying afloat and then some. So he could have just left it at that.
Mm-hmm.
He could have just left it at that. Not Pee Wee Gaskins. No. He's not satisfied with, he's not content with anything.
He had a itch that he had to scratch.
Exactly, Lena. He had an itch. That was it. Well, one of his nieces, Janice Kirby, asked if she could come stay with him on the weekends because her stepdad was slapping her around. Pee Wee claimed that he was very protective of children.
Oh, God.
And he said, of course you can come stay. And she brought along her friend Patricia Alsbrook one time. And he fancied Patricia.
Mm-hmm.
She was 17. He was looking and liking. And he thought, 17's old enough.
Gross.
Yeah, he went over to confront Janice's mother and stepfather at one point about the abuse allegations. And they were like, what are you even talking about? Nothing like that's going on. And they said not only is she not being abused, in fact, she could probably use a whipping.
Yeah.
Because she's a bit out of control. I mean, she's drinking, getting into trouble. And her parents didn't approve of that behavior. Mm-hmm. So they were punishing her, putting rules in place, boundaries, and she would just rebel.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems that Janice didn't like the rules at home, and that's why she went to stay with Uncle Pee Wee.
Mm-hmm.
Around Christmas that year, Janice and Patricia decided they would come stay with Pee Wee and planned to stay there until after New Year's. And boy, he started to see what they were talking about. They were going out late, coming home drunk, in the wee hours of the morning. They were even hanging out with a known drug dealer in the area. And he was like, girls, y'all gotta chill. You can't be running around like this. And if you're gonna keep doing this, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Listen to Uncle Pee Wee setting the girls straight. Well, the next day they were gone. And so were all their things. He looked for them for 5 days when he found them. Completely high.
Oh.
Strung out, he says. He was so angry, he took those girls back to his house and locked them in a room. And he just paced around that house, stewing. He thought, I'm just going to leave them in there for now to think about what they've done. So...
Didn't want them to turn out like him?
I doubt he was even caring about anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But a couple days later, he... opens the door to take them some food. Isn't that nice?
Mm-hmm.
A couple days later. And he sees them shooting up. They're doing drugs in there.
How did they get drugs in there?
I don't know. Maybe she had it in her pocket. I don't know.
Oh.
But he just snapped. He started screaming at them. He grabbed Janice by the arm, and then he began choking her and continued to scream in her face, like, what are y'all doing? You know, you're going to ruin your life. He was calling her a dope whore. He stopped strangling her at one point.
Mm.
And he said she started taunting him, like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Oh, you're going to strangle me? You're going to hurt me? Well, he began choking her again because he didn't like that. He's like, you know, she's going to just keep doing it. She obviously doesn't care about consequences. So he began choking her again until she stopped moving and breathing.
Lord.
At first, Patricia was sitting there kind of like, I mean, she was high.
Right.
So she just kind of was processing things. But she sobered up real quick when she realized her friend was laying there dead.
Oh my gosh.
So she started begging him not to hurt her. And she pled for her life as he beat her with his fists.
Wow.
And he kept beating her until she was unconscious. And it was then that he choked her until she stopped breathing.
Hmm.
So once he had killed them, he basically patted himself on the back and was like, you know, had to be done.
Right.
Had to be done.
Mm-hmm.
They would have just kept doing it.
What
They
a
would have
service he did to
I
society.
know. Exactly. And that's what he felt of himself. That's what he thought of himself. They were they would just have been a burden on their family, so I did everybody a favor.
Wow.
Well, he lived next to this like old farmhouse that was kind of, it was like abandoned. It was near his property. And he knew there was an old septic tank out there. It had a big concrete slab on it, but he thought, if I could move that, I could put them in there. So he waited till nightfall, and he went over there, and I don't know, is it idiot strength? I mean, people don't call it that, but I'm just gonna replace the word with idiot. You know, when someone's so stupid, but they're strong.
Yeah.
Well, he claims to have slid this concrete slab over just enough to fit Patricia's body in there. Now, he says when he handled her slender body, he felt bad for a second that he had killed someone so pretty. But again, you know, he was right back to thinking, you know, forget that. She needed to be punished.
Lord.
So the minute he would have any inkling of like, man, that's too bad. No, he would justify it instantaneously in his mind.
Mm-hmm.
That was that. So he dumped Patricia down into the tank, and he went back to get Janice. He brought her back over to the tank. And when he got back there, he looked in and saw Patricia's body floating in the water. And he thought, I can't put Janice in there. She's family.
Okay.
He thought he'd give her a proper burial.
How nice.
Her family knew that she and Patricia were missing. Like, remember, they had run away.
Right.
But they didn't know that Pee-wee had recovered them.
Found them. Okay.
Yeah. So part of him felt like, I mean, was it because Janice was family? Or was it because he didn't want to bury her near his house? Because that would be like too obvious that it was him that killed her, you know, if she was found. So he loaded up Janice in the trunk of his car and drove her body out to the wooded area in Prospect near his family's graveyard. And yes, the Parrott family had a graveyard on their property. And he says he gave her that proper burial that her family would be proud of.
Okay.
Is he serious right now?
I mean...
He is. He's delusional. Janice was just 15 years old. Patricia was 17 at the time of their deaths. Pee-wee would refer to those murders as quote-unquote serious murders because they were people he knew.
Oh.
And Janice and Patricia would be his first, what he called, serious kills. So the next year in 1970, Pee-wee started traveling the coastal highways in the South, killing people, he says. Later he referred to those as coastal kills, quote unquote. He said he picked up a woman who was hitchhiking in South Carolina. He raped and tortured her relentlessly. He said he got a thrill out of torturing her, and he said all I could think about is how I could do anything I wanted to her. The idea of being completely dominant over someone else was really doing it for him. He claimed that the abuse that he suffered his whole life was now shifting, and the tides were turning, and he was in control now.
Oh.
And he just went wild. So he says he ended up killing her, dumping her body in a swamp, and he claims to have killed about 90 people in this way. Just going up and down the highways, killing hitchhikers, and these coastal kills, he claimed, made up the bulk of his murders. He says it could have gotten up to over 110.
Yeah, because at what point do you stop counting?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've never thought about killing people or counting my kills, so I don't know even what that would entail. We don't have any evidence to substantiate the murder of this hitchhiker in South Carolina. I mean, many bodies have been found. There are many unsolved cases. I don't know of any of them being linked to him. Mm-hmm. And we don't have any other evidence of any of these other coastal kills that he claims. Mm-hmm. But this is just an example of him differentiating, like, the quality of his kills. People that he feels like were serious kills, and people that he feels like were just coastal kills. Like, you know, they weren't really...
Yeah.
Wasn't really murder, because their lives didn't matter. Mm-hmm. I didn't know them, so... Pee-wee also told a twisted tale of another murder he committed while he was back home between one of his traveling the highways, killing hitchhikers, rendezvous, or, sagas. It could be true, though, and I'll explain why. He said that 2 men approached him, randomly, asking him to get rid of someone, a little girl, involved in snuff films. She was going to rat them out because she was a minor.
Wow.
So they brought him this young girl with short, brown, curly hair. She was tied up and gagged in a chair in the middle of the woods, and the men left her with Pee-wee. And he says he raped her and then strangled her with a scarf that she was wearing. He planned to bury her right there in those woods, but he thought he heard something, he thought he heard somebody in the area, and he just ran off, so he just left her there. Now, later he saw on the news that the daughter of Representative James Catino was missing, politician.
Yeah.
She had been missing since December 18th of that year. And he was like, well, I be darn, I just killed that girl.
Oh my gosh.
So, the body of Margaret Peg Catino was found 12 days later by 2 trail riders in a heavily wooded area in Wedgeville in Sumter County, South Carolina. She was just 13 years old. Pee-wee claims Peg as one of his victims. The police did question him multiple times about his potential involvement because #minors, #murder, #disappearance, like whatever you want to... I mean, they had every reason to look at him. Well, he passed a polygraph, and they moved on. What's more, a man named William Jr. Pierce was arrested, tried, and convicted for Peg's murder. But many people believe that Jr. did not kill Peg because his confession seemed really coerced, and he confessed in a different state, which seemed to be the place he was at the time of her murder. And her last known whereabouts were in the area of her murder. So how could he be in that state and kill her where she was found? And they don't believe that she was killed elsewhere and dumped somewhere else. So they believe she was actually killed where she was last seen, is what I'm
Well, and how can you keep your story straight after killing that many people? Like,
right.
You're going to cross stories between one and the other. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, he was a liar.
Yeah.
But I don't know, I'm leaning towards that this guy was innocent. They did have DNA. They had a lot of evidence from Peg's murder. There was a lot of evidence at the scene. And Junior did fight for a new trial and for DNA technology to be used in the 90s. But apparently Hurricane Hugo had destroyed it all.
Good.
And that was like one of the worst hurricanes we've ever had in South Carolina in the late 80s. I think it was 89. Anywho, all that said, it was quite possible that Pee-wee did kill Peg. After the murder of Peg Catino, he decided to lay low. And by lay low, I mean he decided to not kill anyone for just a minute. Just a minute. But that changed because he found out that someone by the name of Martha Ann Dix, who went by Clyde, because she wore men's clothing, they called her Clyde. But he found out that she sold drugs to his niece Janice and Patricia.
Oh, so she had to pay?
That's right. He tracked down Clyde and he was like, I mean, I killed them for doing wrong. Like, you're going down too.
Right.
So he had stolen some acid from a photographer, like the acid you use to develop film. He put it in some Coca-Cola. And he said that he had stolen this acid a while back. And he had kept it just in case he needed to use it on somebody.
Just for a rainy day.
Yeah, because the photographer was like, now, son, you don't want to touch this because it'll drop you like a hot potato, you know? So he's like, I'm just going to put some of that in my pocket because I could probably kill someone with that. So he put it in her Coke. She took a drink. And he says that she barely had time to lower her drink down before she just
dropped
dead. So he loads her body into his trunk and he headed out to find a rural area where he could conceal her body. Now he's winding through the back roads of South Carolina and he sees this other car in the distance coming up on him. It was a police car. The blue lights came on and he pulled Pee-wee over. Pee-wee acted cool, calm, and when the officer got out of his car, so did Pee-wee. Pee-wee got out of his car and walked to the back of his car and kind of like leaned on the back of the trunk. These days you'd get shot for that.
Right. Sir, get back
so the
in
officers,
the car.
Exactly. The officer's like, what are you doing out here? Why are you driving around in this, it was like an industrial area, and he's just driving around these back roads at late at night. And Pee-wee was like, oh, you know, and he just like coming up with all these. He was a master manipulator. So who knows what he really said to get out of this. But they're shooting the breeze. And the guy's like, well, you haven't been drinking. So the officer just let him go. I think the cop expected him to be drunk.
Okay.
You know, like most of the time when cops pull people over and they're doing weird things on the road, they're drunk or they're under the influence of something.
Right.
And Pee-wee, to be honest, that alcohol just never did it for him. That just wasn't his thing. He didn't really drink a whole lot. He just murdered a whole lot.
Yeah.
Murdering did it for him. So, and like even his employers, like the farmers and the people he worked for, said that he didn't drink. And that's why they liked him and they hired him for work. Because while all the other, you know, peons and laborers were showing up drunk or not showing up, he would actually show up for work, not drunk.
Right.
So anyway, he got back in the car. He kept driving until he found some like eroded ground that it had rained heavily the day before, and there was kind of like big, you know, erosion ditches, and he just dumped her out in one of those ditches. And with that, I'm going to end part 2 because I think that is a lot of mayhem right there. In part 3, it will get worse. Like it will get worse. If you can believe that.
I can't believe you're just going to cut us off like that.
Well, I mean, it's
How
a good
else
place
do
to
you do
stop.
it?
Yeah, how else do you do it? It's not like, yeah, he didn't do anything organized, so I just kind of have to cut it somewhere. And unfortunately, Clyde, rest in peace. Janice, Patricia, rest in peace. Okay, guys. Well, this was fun. Let's do it again.
Yeah, see ya.
Sadly. Bye.
Bye. Well, thank you for listening to Cousins on Crime. If you're enjoying our podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating so that other true crime fans can find us.
If you have any case suggestions or just want to say hey, email us at cousinsoncrime@gmail.com. And be sure to follow us on Instagram, where we post case photos and information at Cousins on Crime Podcast.